Hello everyone and welcome to another Endgame episode with Coach B and MasterChess.com. In this video, we're going to take a look at the positions that involve a king and rook versus king and knight. When fighting against the rook, a knight may have more trouble than the bishop. However, most of these positions are drawn. The best way to play this position is keeping the knight next to the king. If the knight gets separated from the king, it can be lost. So let's take a look at how to play these positions. In this first position, it's white to move, and he should be able to achieve a draw with correct play. So here, he's going to start with knight to f2, checking the black king. After king to e3, the knight to d1 check. The king doesn't want to repeat the position, so he's going to go to f3. After this, knight to c3, attacking the rook. After rook to c2, attacking the knight, here's a critical moment. The correct play here is knight to d1. Again, the best way to defend here is keeping the knight close to the king. If white makes the mistake here of moving somewhere else, let's say knight to d5, he's going to run into some trouble. Here, black will respond with rook to c4, taking control of most of the squares away from the knight, so the knight cannot go next to the king. So here, the rook attacks the squares c3 and b4. Also, the king from f3 attacks the squares e3 and f4. So here, the white knight will have some trouble getting closer to the white king. Two tries that white can have is knight to b6 or knight to f6. Let's take a look at both of those. Let's take a look at knight to f6 first. Well, after this, the rook will go to d4, taking control of the squares e4 and d5. Also, the black king takes control of the square g4. From here, let's say knight to h7. Well, after this, king to f4. Taking control of the square g5 away from the knight. If the knight tries to retreat, rook to d6. Now taking control of the squares d7 and e6 from the knight. Let's say knight to h7, king to f5, grabbing the squares g5 and f6 from the knight. And now there's not much that white can do to save his knight. And now if the knight goes to f8, rook to d8, attacking the knight. And now the knight cannot run away as the squares d7, e6, and f6 are taken care of. So all he's got is knight to h7, but after rook to h8, the knight is gone. He doesn't have any squares that he can escape to. Coming back after knight to d5 and rook to c4, we looked at the knight going to f6. If he tries to run the other way, let's say knight to b6, black can respond with rook to b4, attacking the knight, and also taking control of the squares c4 and a4. And now white doesn't have many options. If he goes to d5, well, after rook to e4 check, the knight will be lost. If white responds with king to f1, after rook to d4, the knight is threatened and checkmate at the same time. So here, after the king moves away, the knight will be lost. And if the king moves to d1, well, now rook to d4 forks the king and the knight is lost again. Coming back after rook to b4, if here white responds with knight to d7, well, after this, black can play rook to b5. A square diagonally from the knight, it's a good place to be for the black king or for the rook. It takes control of many squares from the knight. For example, this move here takes control of the squares c5 and b6, also takes control of the square e5 from the knight. So the only things he's got is knight to f6. After rook to e5 check, king to d1, rook to e6, attacking the knight. From here, if the knight goes to d5, then the rook to d6 will pin the knight and the knight is lost. And if he retreats, let's say with knight to g8, now king to f4. All the squares are taken away from the knight and the knight is trapped. So black, all he needs to do is go ahead and pick up the knight, and then he's going to be able to win this game. Black is simply going to pick up the knight and then win the game from here. And I know I didn't go over all the variations where the knight could possibly go, but I just want to point out the idea that you want to keep the knight close to the king, because if you separate the knight from the king, it's very likely that it's going to be attacked and then be able to be taken away. So coming back after the rook attacked the knight on c2, again, the best play here is knight to d1, not separating the knight away from the king. And there's not much that black can do here to force a win. After something like rook to e2, king to f1. Rook to h2, threatening checkmate on h1, well, now king to e1. After rook to c2, well, king to f1, and this repeats the position, and black cannot make any progress. Therefore, white is able to achieve a draw. As we've seen in the previous example, we noticed that the king and knight can draw against the king and rook. However, if the player with the knight is forced in a corner, things are actually different, and he will not be able to get a draw anymore. Here, with white to move, the king is in check. After king to g3, black is totally lost. The king cannot make any moves as he's stuck in the corner, and anywhere the knight would go, he would be able to be taken. The squares h3 and f3 are taken by the white king on g3, and then the square e2 is occupied by the rook. So after the knight moves away, white will simply be able to capture the knight and then win the game from here. And here's another example, very similar to the previous example. The only difference is that the knight is in the corner on h1 and the king is on g1. So we just reverse the king and the knight. Well, this position is also lost. It doesn't matter who's in the corner, the king or the knight, these positions are lost. Here it's black to move, but if the knight moves, the square f2 is controlled by the king and the rook, and if he steps there, the rook will simply take it. The square g3, same thing, the king will simply take the knight. And if the king moves on f1, well, rook to a1 will be checkmate. And in this last position, we have the king in the corner again. However, the knight is on g2. Well, this position is also lost. Well, if it's black to move, the only two tries that he has is knight to h4 check or knight to e1 check. Well, let's take a look at both of those options. If the knight goes to h4, checking the white king, well, after this, king to g3, attacking the knight. And now the knight has to move away. After knight to g6, rook to a1 is checkmate. If the knight goes to f5, checking the white king, after king to h3, there are no more checks. So here checkmate is threatened with rook to a1, so the king has to go to g1. After this, rook to g8 check. If the king moves to f1 or f2, well, after rook to f8, the knight is lost, being pinned to the king. And coming back, if the black king moves to h1 instead, well, here, after rook to f8, the knight is attacked, so he has to move away. The only way to prevent checkmate on f1 is knight to e3. But after rook to f3, the knight is attacked again and has nowhere to go. Any knight move here will be checkmate. Going to c2 or f1, the rook will simply go on f1, checkmating the black king. So the only way to stop checkmate is king to g1, from which white will simply capture the knight and then win the game from here. And coming back, knight to f3 doesn't work as the white king can simply take the knight, and the only other try that black has is moving the knight to g2. But here, again, after rook to a1 check, the only way to prevent checkmate is moving the knight to e1, but after that, the rook will simply take the knight and checkmate is achieved again. And coming back from the very beginning, we looked at knight to h4 check. The other try will be knight to e1 check. Well, from here, the white king can simply go to f2, and now the knight has to move again. After knight to d3 check, king to g3, knight to e1, rook to a1 will pin the knight, and now the knight is gone. King to g1, and the rook takes the knight, and checkmate is achieved. And coming back after king to g3, black doesn't have any other good options. Moving the knight to f4 or f2 will be taken by the white king, and if he moves anywhere else, rook to a1 will be again checkmate. So in conclusion, in the knight versus rook battle, the side that's defending, meaning the side with the knight, should avoid being separated from the king and also should avoid getting his pieces in the corner. If he manages to prevent that from happening, a draw can be achieved. And I want to close out with this example because this is very common in chess endgames. In this position, it's black to move, and I would like you to pause the video and think about how you would play this position. Alright, then I'm going to go over the answer, and I hope that after watching this video, you found the correct move, pawn to e1 promoting to a knight with check, which this will lead into a draw. Coming back from the beginning, I do want to mention that many times people make the mistake here of moving the pawn to e1 promoting to a queen. Well, after rook to a1, this will be checkmate, and it would be a terrible way to end this game, especially that the draw could have been achieved. If you liked my video, please subscribe and don't forget to check out my new website, masteryourchess.com, where you can learn, practice, test, and master your chess knowledge.